As Germany completed the first phase of designs after the Anglo-German naval agreement, a long memo went out that called, amongst other things, for the development of a new long-range submarine. Since they were still operating at this stage under the limits to submarine tonnage in said agreement, the idea of a single-purpose submarine had been rejected, and the new type would have to be able to conduct anti-shipping attacks, mining efforts, and reconnaissance all packaged into a single hull. Bearing in mind that at this stage the envisaged starting point for submarine voyages was still the northern German ports, the memo specified that the sub had to be able to achieve a high surface speed and maintain that speed for a sprint all the way around Europe into the Western Mediterranean to operate against communication and supply lines, and have enough fuel left at the end of that sprint for prolonged operations in the area. That was simply not possible with existing submarine design types, and so a new and much larger submarine was obviously needed. Although not itself a successful design, the Type 1A was a bit bigger than the Type 7, and so it was taken as a starting point, with the initial call being for a sub that displaced about 730 tons on the surface, with a 20-knot maximum speed and a 14-knot cruising speed whilst surfaced, armed with 6 torpedo tubes, 4 forward and 2 aft, with a full set of reloads available, and possibly some more in storage units outside the pressure hull. Mine carrying was of course also a requirement. As a result of these stated needs, as well as the pressure hull being slightly expanded, the hull casing was then made considerably larger, as well as drawn out fore and aft to allow for faster transit on the surface. But somewhere along the line, an ever-increasing feedback loop of demands took hold, and by the time the first Type 9A was ordered in July 1936, with construction to start in the spring of the following year, it had grown considerably. Now, the sub displaced a little over 1,030 tons on the surface and another 120 tons or so when submerged. Its surface speed was only a little better than a Type 7 at just over 18 knots, thanks to a pair of diesel engines that generated around 4,300 horsepower, but this was obviously well short of the initially stated top speed goal. Just under 1,000 horsepower's worth of electric motors gave an underwater speed of just under 8 knots, which was roughly on a par with a Type 7. Torpedo tubes were, as initially requested, with a full internal set of reloads, but there were now a total of 10 torpedoes carried externally, which brought the total up to 22. These could only be brought into the sub slowly using winches while the vessel was surfaced, which presupposed that the sub was going to be operating in an area free from patrolling enemies, especially aircraft. A single 105mm deck gun was also included, with options for additional anti-aircraft guns to be added if needed. After 8 of these subs, another 14 were built to the Type 9B specification. This brought in a little more fuel, and thus more range, in exchange for another 20 or so tons in displacement, but a slight drop in submerged speed as a result of a slight increase in beam to accommodate the larger fuel tanks. Then came the main variant, the Type 9C, which would come in 2 flavours, the 9C and the 9C-40, with 54 and 87 examples built respectively. The 9C would be just a fraction longer than the 9A and 9B, but the C-40 would also be ever so slightly wider as well. In both cases, this was almost entirely concerned with fitting ever-increasing fuel loads, with the 9C-40 having reached a maximum range of 11,400 nautical miles at 12 knots on the surface, as compared to 8,100 nautical miles for the Type 9A, with longer ranges possible if cruising speed was cut a little to, say, 10 knots. Anti-aircraft provision across all 4 types was initially standardized as a single 37mm anti-aircraft gun, this being the single-shot C-30 variant, so it was mainly used for letting the 20mm cannon crew know that they were needed to do actual anti-aircraft work, although as the war progressed, other, more effective anti-aircraft guns were also fitted as well as, or instead of, this basic outfit. The final variant, the Type 9D, changed things up a lot. being 14% longer, 9% wider, and displacing about 41% more than even the Type 9C-40. Instead of 2 diesels, it was supposed to use no less than 6, 4 for cruising, with another pair dedicated to either battery charging or providing an extra burst of speed on the surface. Each engine was rated at 1500 brake horsepower, so either 6000 or 9000 horsepower could be put through the screws on the surface depending on need. Unfortunately, the pressure hull was still the same size, the expansion in dimensions being almost entirely more fuel tanks and a finer outer casing. And that many diesels in a confined space proved to be hopelessly hot and exhaust heavy at best. Thus, only 2 subs were built to this specification, and they were rapidly converted into transport subs, losing 4 of their engines in the process. Thus dubbed Type 9D1, they were superseded by the Type 9D2, which went back to the original Type 9 power plant with a pair of smaller 580 horsepower diesels added mostly for battery charging, although as with the Type 9D1s they could still supplement the main engines as well, or even replace them if you wanted to travel at very slow speeds in surface cruising mode to save fuel. These subs could reach a colossal 23,700 nautical miles at 12 knots on the surface, a phenomenal range, and they had an additional pair of torpedoes for good measure. The last gasp of this design was supposed to be the Type 9D-42, but sources conflict on this. Some don't mention this variant at all, others have it being almost essentially identical to the Type 9D2, and still others say it had an even greater range, and still others say that it had more powerful diesels. Whatever the case, few seem to have been started, and only 2 9D-42s are supposed to have actually entered service. Of the 194 vessels built, only 30 survived the war in German hands, and none of those are left. The 2 which have survived, U-505 and U-534, have come to us via different methods. The Type 9C U-505 was captured during the war by the US Navy Hunting Group, and the Type 9C-40 U-534 was sunk just after the war officially ended, while it was probably making a run for South America, before being salvaged much later in the early 1990s. U-505 can be found in Chicago, while U-534 is currently undergoing conservation work in Birkenhead in the UK.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.